the next game, I'll be talking about a flight combat shooter game that nobody remembers and considered it to be a forgotten PS1 game, but yet one of them who was a game sound effects for the soundtrack came from the once and famous legend Tommy Tallarico. And that's game number 29, Algaia Warrior F-111X. Or Algaia Warrior F-111X, depending if you want to call it that, or in short, Algaia Warrior, which I'm going to be saying in this entire video. Published by Virgin Interactive and developed by Black Ops Entertainment. The objective of the game is to taking down a bunch of terrorists in various countries, which there are 10, more on that in the review section down the line. You control a fighter jet that originated from an F-111 aardvark used for superior terrain and weapon guidance system, and is based on a real aircraft, by the way, including the other two, which I'm going to say it right now, but combined with a YF-23 used for high-performance airframe and an X-31 used for thrust vectoring maneuverability to form a powerful warplane that can fly through everywhere in the world and be used for covert operations by the Air Force. All you need to do is, like I said again, take down a bunch of terrorists and save the world before the destruction happens. No development for this game because there's little to no information about the history of the title and again consider it to be forgotten, aside from the already mentioned game sound effects guy and the people who worked on it as well. So instead, let's talk a brief history about the publisher and developer for this game right now. The publisher, Virgin Interactive, or originally known as Virgin Games, was formed in 1983 as a subsidiary located in London, England, UK, by founder Nick Alexander, after leaving Thorn EMI, known for music, video, and defense equipment. Their first few games came from freelancer developers from their own in-house development team known as the Gang of Five, with some of them became successful titles like Sorcery in 1984 and Then There Pilot of the Future in 1986. But in 1987, Virgin Games got acquired by Mastertronic, a distributor in Irvine, California, USA, known for distributing the Master System in the United Kingdom, and introduced Sega to the European market as well, which in long term became highly successful and would expand rapidly in the coming years. After being merged by them, Virgin changed their branding name to Virgin Mastertronic in 1988. This was a turning point for both the company, and originally it was supposed to be a long-term partnership, but it didn't last long and ultimately left Mastertronic after they got acquired by Sega Enterprises in 1991. After the short-lived merger that went nowhere, Virgin decided they would return as a small publishing unit and change their branding name again. This time they would be called Virgin Interactive in 1993, which turned out to be a decent move at the time because during those times, in the early to mid-90s, they would release some of the most memorable titles, either good, bad, or meh, that only the people who grew up during the 90s would remember. Such titles like Chuck Rock 1 and 2, Prince of Persia, NES version only, Dune 1 and 2, MC Kids, Global Gladiators, Cannon Fodder 1 and 2, Dragon, The Bruce Lee Story, The Seventh Guest, Cool Spot, Spot Goes to Hollywood, The Terminator, Sega CD version only, Robocop vs. The Terminator, Beneath the Sky, Creature Shock, and even some of the Disney games like Aladdin, Genesis version only, The Jungle Book, and The Lion King. So yeah, given their track record, I say that Virgin Interactive did had a small decent success with their games during the first half of the 90s. However, everything would change during the second half of the 90s because In 1995, Virgin Interactive was getting ready to start publishing games for the upcoming 5th generation consoles, mainly the Saturn and PlayStation respectively, but they wanted to publish at least one game during the first year of the system in the US. So what was the best option of picking the first published game? Well, to them, they grabbed a development studio who were very new to the video game market, and that's Black Ops Entertainment, located in Santa Monica, California, US. Created back in 1994 by 4 unnamed founders that were graduates from MIT, which stands for Massachusetts Institute of Technology, when they developed an SNES volleyball prototype game that went nowhere and considered it to be lost, if everyone really cares about a sports game. After the deal with Virgin, their first game would be a flight combat game called Agile Warrior. In order to create that game in the span of a year, they recruited a larger team. Originally developed out of their homes, which is kind of shocking given the fact that it was the 90s and rarely happens, which would become a normal thing in the present day, mainly indie developers, but finished with the game in their new established Santa Monica office. Once the final version of the game was finished, they gave it to Virgin Interactive, made copies of it, and was ready to be published. And when it was released for the system in November 21st, 1995 in North America, January 13th, 1996 in Japan, and March 2nd, 1996 in Europe, Virgin's first game for the PS1 turned out to be a complete, utter failure, with the reviews scores giving it bad reviews, with one such reviewer from Next Generation rated the game 2 stars out of 5, and stated that if you stick with it, there is some fun to be had, but not enough to overcome the game's many small and large frustrations. After the poor reception, the game was completely forgotten and was regulated as a PS1 game that's a poor man's version of Air Combat because they're both flight combat games released at the same year, more on that later. But here's the question. Is it still a bad game as people say it is a few decades later? Well, only one way to find out, and that is to review it. Starting now. The graphics are not good, even back in 1995. I mean, look at the backgrounds. These pixelated real-life clouds look badly paced and just dated compared to the other PS1 titles that I tackled in the past. As for the models for enemy vehicles, buildings, and etc., they're fine, but not particularly great due to their simple designs and whatnot. Though the one and only decent thing I have to say is the fighter jet you're controlling, and in every level the jet has its own unique color designs to match the style of the area you're in. And last is the ground terrain. It's bland and fine, but also, why am I mentioning this useless info? Well, because I think it may be the first game, in the US for the system of course, that actually changed the ground terrain simply by using napalm to make the high terrain to being flat or a bowl. And also, when you use a powerful bomb weapon, you can actually see the texture floor changed when it hits the ground. I kinda find it as an interesting fact and a neat game design, despite being a forgotten game. Next is the presentation. Starting with the FMV video cutscenes, it's fine. Simple and straight to the point, with the commander telling you the primary objectives that you need to destroy, and that's about it. The only thing I have to say is that the cutscenes aren't particularly bad, nor is it good either. It's just straight up neutral, with a few mid-90s tone to it, and nothing really that bizarre. Well, except for the ending, which... Yeah, the video speaks for itself. Now for the HUD, it's basic. You have your view, armor, and throt, which you have the option to go fast or slow. Your weapon selection, your small map in the bottom right, or your big map in the middle by pressing the circle button, and the enemy radar in the bottom left. That's all I got to say because again, it's basic, though I will go more in depth to it in the gameplay segment. Just wait for it. And finally are the option features. You have your standard music and sound effects options, and also 2 different kinds of save features, either saving the game if you have a memory card or typing a password if you don't have a memory card. And last but not least is the option to turn on or off in collision with the ground, and that's pretty much it. Man, this presentation segment is uninteresting aside from the FMV cutscenes. Anyways, let's move on to the music. It's fine, but forgettable at the same time. While it does have some alright tunes, but also generic ones as well. Take a listen and hear it for yourself. So yeah, this is not a good soundtrack for the game, which is kind of baffling since it came from one of the famous, or used to be famous gaming composer, Tommy Tallarico, who is widely known for making some of the greatest music in gaming from the 90s and 2000s. And yeah, I know he isn't technically involved with the music and more worked as a sprite actor and in-game sound effects, but at least give him some involvement with the music to make it a bit better. But oh well, what happened, happened, and there is nothing we can do about it since it's almost a 3-decade-year-old game. What a wasted potential. Oh, and as for the sound effects, it's fine and really nothing to comment on, though the only major gripe is the beeping if you're low either on gas or armor. But that's about it. And finally, let's talk about the gameplay. The controls at first is very hard to get used to for beginners, but once you somewhat figure out how to control the jet, you realize that it's very simple to handle, minus trying to find the weapon selection. Next is the weapons. You have the normal fire attack, but you also have a variety of different weapons like missiles, bombs, nukes, and etc. Some are very useful and some are not and just felt weaker versions to the more powerful ones. You can get these weapons either destroying an enemy vehicles or objects like buildings, tents, and trees for some reason. There are also fuel and armor pickups if again destroying the vehicles or objects, which you're going to need it really fast due to the difficulty in the game. And finally, the items that can drain your health or armor if you see the TNT or bomb icon. but that's not that big of a deal because I rarely seen these items and hardly ever noticed them in the first place. And finally, the pacing and fun factor of the game. Now, even though I did manage to figure out the controls and know what the objectives to each level are, so it's good and all. However, that doesn't mean the game sucks. Because man, this may be one of the most boring and sluggish of a game I have ever played, with 3 major problems, starting with the first one being the difficulty. Now, usually the game starts out very easy in the first few levels, but gradually gets more difficult as you progress your way from level to level. Unfortunately, this is not one of those times because the difficulty from these levels are inconsistent. Like one level, it's way too hard and easily die many times, or in another level, it's too easy and manage to complete the level with only one try. So, it's basically a chance meter which is either easy or hard. Second is, where are you going? Where you need to find the enemy objectives, but the small map doesn't know where the enemies are, so I have to use the big map to know where I'm going, and this happens a lot in these levels so forth, that I have to rely on it throughout the game, which is bad because despite the bigger map and also finding the objectives, you can't tell if it's an enemy from the far distance until you get closer to it, either if it's the right one or the wrong one. So yet again, it's by chance. And finally, the third, and it's a big one, that all the levels are bland, generic, and the same. Yes, I know that most of the levels have very different environments, and even one of them being an ocean level. But I'm sorry to say this, but no matter how the levels are either different or not, they all look the same and forgettable. Even the final level being an Area 51 stage is just too generic, bland, and underwhelming for a final level. Well, except for the hard difficulty, I guess. But that's not saying much. Now I know that I'm complaining about a flight combat shooter game from 1995 that was rushed within a year, which you can obviously tell by the gameplay footage, and if that was the first game for the system to enter that genre, then I wouldn't be complaining about it less, though the result would be the exact same. But then you remember that Air Combat was released the same year as Agile Warrior, in the US of course, which many people at the time called it a clone to Air Combat. Although I don't agree with that statement, since they were both made by different developers and from very different countries as well. But at least I understand where the people were coming from back in 1995, since they were the only 2 flight combat games for the system during its first year. But here's the difference. Air Combat, or Ace Combat if you live in Japan, despite not aging the best and also have that first installment feel to it, however, it manages to be at least enjoyable and even want to continue the game since the fun factor can be there at some certain places because the development team took time to polish the game and trying to make a great experience for the player too. And also it took them just 1 year to make, which is just shocking to hear. Why am I talking about that fact? Well, Algaia Warrior also took 1 year to make. Unfortunately, they didn't have time to polish the game whatsoever and feel incomplete, which leads us to the conclusion. This game was completely rushed and straight up unfinished, with the graphics being dated and unappealing, the presentation, which I don't have anything to comment on, especially the FMV cutscenes, the music being mid and a bit of a wasted potential, and really should have picked him to be involved with the soundtrack instead of being a sprite actor and doing in-game sound effects. and the gameplay, despite some decent controls for a flight combat game, being just straight up bad and very, very boring at the same time. It really feels bad to say about Black Ops Entertainment's first game, since they were very new to developing a game and didn't have quite a lot of time for this game due to the deadline from Virgin Interactive. Fortunately, this would not be their only flight combat game, because a year later, they would develop their second game called Black Dawn, released for the PlayStation and Saturn in 1996. This did much better than Algaia Warrior, since it uses the same engine to that game, but that's another story for another time. And we'll talk about this game for a future video, as well as the other 8 titles and the development studio too. As for the publisher, Virgin Interactive, they would continue to publish more titles for the system, despite their first one being not a success and quickly forgotten altogether, which normally I would talk about what they did after the game's release. But I'm not going to this time, because the things with the company gets really complicated, like changing companies, ownership, and even being involved with Capcom, shockingly. So yeah, I will also have to talk about it in a future video, depending which game they were involved at. And now, for my final thoughts of the game. It sucks, plain and simple, with some few decent elements sparkled in, though it's not enough to save it. Originally, I was going to give it a 3 out of 6 because of the decent controls and how to get used to it, but after witnessing the inconsistent difficulty, unappealing graphics, and a boring / uninteresting / repetitive experience, I give my official rating a 2 out of 6. Next time, on the PlayStation era, I talk about Sony's first published game in the sports genre, NFL Game Day, a game that was a good to decent success for the series and was completely made due to EA Sports' most popular franchise series, Madden NFL, failed to enter its first year for the system due to the strict fall season deadline. Thanks for watching.